In this video, I'd like to consider a bit of a taboo subject, and that is, just how easy is a GCSE? Now, I know it's been part of the propaganda of the press to suggest that the GCSE is a devalued exam. And that's not really a bandwagon I want to jump on. I'm just asking in objective terms, how difficult or how easy is a GCSE? One approach to this is very logical. So I was training teachers in my school on literacy, and speaking to a science teacher, he said I don't need to teach literacy in science because the spelling and punctuation is only worth 1 mark in a 6-mark question. It therefore doesn't pay me to invest much time in that or any time at all. It's the science that's going to get them the marks. And that's quite a logical assumption to make as a teacher, but it limits your students, doesn't it, to never being able to get 100%. Well, luckily for me, I have a strange test case at home. My son, who took GCSEs in all 3 sciences and got 100% in each of them. And so I asked him how he did it, and he said, well, I wanted to get 100% in physics, chemistry and biology, so I learned to spell 3 keywords, that's what he worked out per question, and therefore he got the marks. And this prompted me to think, well, actually, should we expect many of our students to aim for at least 100%? Now, I know you can't get more than 100%, but we could teach children beyond 100% for their exam. Is this practical? Well, actually, I think it is. So Harry was in a year group of around 210 students, and there were 2 top sets ahead of him, so that's 64 students who his teachers reckoned on past performance by year 9 were better than he was. So his own expectations allowed him to completely outperform the students in the 2 sets above. And I wonder if we do that in schools. Do we give our students lower expectations than we should? Quite logically, not out of any kind of laziness, but actually thinking, well, a GCSE is the limit of year 11, and that's what we're teaching towards. But what would happen if we did the reverse and thought the GCSE was just a marker, just a milestone, but actually we were teaching well beyond? For example, you might take your driving test when you were already a much better driver than this kind of plodding 10 to 2, 30 miles an hour creature who has to pass the test. And what if we viewed GCSEs in the same way? So I tried to find some data that wasn't ideological in origin, in other words, wasn't being put forward by somebody slamming the GCSE system. So I went to my YouTube account and noticed this phenomenon. These peaks you can see here are just before the English literature exam. So plodding along here, probably about 500 views a day, moving towards the exam, and then suddenly, the day before the exam, there are 24,000 views. This gives us, I think, a very clear insight into how students revise. At least 24,000 in ratio to 500 revise the night before. And the astonishing thing is that for many of my students who watch these videos, this actually seems to work. In other words, 1 day's cramming the night before an exam can actually lead to really high success. Now, I'm not recommending that as a way of teaching our students. We'd like them to be revising much before that and consolidating their learning. But I'm using this figure to ask the question, well, just how difficult is a GCSE? The other data I had available within schools was looking at our students' use of GCSE Pod. So GCSE Pod provide a range of podcasts, each lasting typically between 3 minutes and 6 minutes. And I correlated the use of all our students' GCSE Pods downloads and streaming, and then compared it to their actual results, and then compared it to their FFTD predicted grade. And what I found was this kind of magic number. Virtually every single student who exceeded 3.5 hours of GCSE pod videos on one subject beat their FFTD predicted grade. In other words, they got well into the top 25% of progress based on their prior attainment, just from 3.5 hours work. That is astonishing, isn't it? And again, it suggests very strongly that GCSEs are not that difficult. They don't demand that much study. My own literature videos are a similar amount of time, 2 hours on an inspector calls, 2 hours on Of Mice and Men, and if they're studying poetry, there is at best another hour on that, so 5 hours in total. And this is a typical response that I get from viewers of my channel. Here's a student who's come back over a year after taking the literature and has got an A star, and that's not that unusual in the comments that I get, and it's not because of the teaching they think they're getting in schools. And this isn't me having a go at teachers, it's me pointing out that just 4 or 5 hours of my videos gets this student an A star in a school in which he's obviously not achieving anything like that. And I'm doing that not to say how fantastic my videos are, but just to say that's all the revision it takes. 4 hours of really focused revision is going to get you to succeed brilliantly. English literature, like many GCSEs, is overwhelmingly content-based. It needs a high level of understanding, but it doesn't need a massive level of skill in the same way that the sciences don't need massive levels of skill. It's content knowledge and understanding that's required. And this suggests very strongly that for most subjects, getting really intensive revision of only about 4 hours is going to get our students dramatically improved grades. Well, what if we could get them to revise in these chunks of time 3 or 4 times a year instead of just at the end of the year? What would our results look like then? In order to succeed in this way, we need to change the mindset of students. So a mock isn't just a mock. We have to get them to think of it as a real practice and force them to revise for it. The other thing we have to do is get them to keep going to the end of the exam. When we got our students to retake, if they hadn't put enough effort, 50% of those who retook improved when retaking. Although this is anecdotal, in talking to those students, they improved despite doing hardly any extra revision. And I think a useful question to ask is this one. In a brilliant school, how many students, what percentage, would we expect to revise for a retake, and what percentage would we expect to improve? Wouldn't it be closer to 80%? So how do we do that? Well, one of the shocking things I found as I invigilated some mocks, and I was invigilating the higher tier, was this. With 25 minutes to go in the English exam, which is a 2-hour paper, students had largely stopped. Not all of them, but a majority of students had stopped within the last 25 minutes of the exam. And if we can't teach that resilience and stickability and that desire to complete the exam, then we're going to fail. It doesn't matter how good our teaching is, it doesn't matter how fantastic our lessons are, if the students are going to squander nearly a quarter of the time allocated to them in the exam, then we're on a hiding to nothing. In other words, we could dramatically improve the performance of our students without making any difference to our teaching at all. We simply have to focus on changing this. So how will we model success to students in our mocks? How will we get them to take it seriously? And how will we get them to put in the effort? I wonder what would happen if instead of giving them a 2-hour paper to complete in 2 hours, we gave it to them to complete in 3. Would they then work for 2 hours and slack for the last hour? Alternatively, what if we ask them to complete it in 1 hour. I think we need to play around with the time that we give to students to give them this idea that they have to put in the effort and they have to write at speed and they have to focus on the content and check their work. We have to reward those kinds of behaviours, and we also have to punish them when they don't comply. Possibly our biggest barrier is the way that we've designed our curriculum. I think this is the story that we tell our students in school, that in order to be brilliant, they're going to have to sit an exam at the end of the year, at the end of year 11, and that's when their brilliance will be revealed. And so all our efforts as teachers are directed towards the end of year 11. You only have to look at the difference between teachers working at grades and working towards grades to see how much this influences a teacher's thought and therefore their students' thought. My teaching is therefore directed towards the end of year 11, and I've heard this many times. I become frustrated that mocks get in the way. Why have we got them in November? That's the wrong place. Why have we got another one in February that's getting in the way of my curriculum? And we kind of lose sight of the fact that actually it's the mock that the students have to succeed in. They have to learn to succeed in the exam. It's not that they don't have the content knowledge by and large, it's that they're not taking the time to learn it and retain it and then consistently apply it under exam conditions. They're simply not putting in the effort. It's not that you haven't taught them enough. And this, I think, makes success very, very difficult because we're always having that end point of the end of year 11 in mind. But what if instead we decided that our students ought to be ready to take their exam in November of year 11 or the end of year 10? What if we taught them beyond the GCSE and gave them mock exams that included more questions than they get in the real thing and harder questions than they get in the real thing? What if we raised their expectations as a way of raising our own? Hattie's research is quite clear about the power of expectations. He gives them a value of a D of 0.43, and that's about a year's progress above what we'd expect. And that's completely free. That's not the teacher going and preparing extra resources or becoming an awesome teacher overnight. It's simply changing a mindset. And he has this very interesting observation. The higher the expectation, the higher the pupil's achievement. This is true even where teachers are lied to and given incorrect, and by that I mean too high information about prior attainment. In other words, if somebody tells you that you're teaching very able students, your expectations of them as able students leads them to get higher marks, even if none of them in the class were able students. And the research on that's quite clear. And then the corollary of that, where teachers hold lower expectations, they do this for all the students in the class. Therefore, limiting ourselves to that final end point of year 11, in effect, I think, gives us lower expectations for everyone. We don't expect any of our students to get 100% because it seems inconceivable if we're teaching right up to the last minute. But what if we stopped our teaching in November of year 11 and after that we simply revised and expected students to get 100% and move on to more difficult content? What result would happen then? Amazingly, our students get far more value out of our high expectations than they do out of our hard-earned degree. So the level of qualification has an almost insignificant effect on the progress of our students, even in maths where we would think it was crucial. And the message here is quite simple. It's not the constant delivery of subject content that is going to give our students progress. It's just thinking about them in a different way, having much higher expectations and moving through the curriculum more quickly.